The blueprint. So, of course, the Carolina Panthers dropped their teaser/trailer last week on all social media platforms, teasing the blueprint. This became a thing, like 3 or 4 years ago?
Yeah, it's not that old.
No, not that old at all. Still relatively new. The Carolina Panthers last night released the first episode of this particular season, going over draft night and just showing some ins and outs of how things were going and showing some behind the scenes. So we're just going to kind of give some of our immediate reactions because actually we literally just watched it probably like an hour or so after the preview of it on YouTube. So just real quick, I mean, anything that stood out to you guys, anything that surprised you all, et cetera, and then we'll also kind of tie in the article that dropped as well. And I don't even know who wrote that article. I believe Cassidy Hill contributed to it a little bit, but I don't know. But we'll go through the article, the Inside the Draft Room article that the Carolina Panthers released as well. But anything that, kind of surprised you guys, any instant reactions, whatever, share your thoughts.
I think, it was cool to see that everybody was, on the same page about everything, and it was kind of it was going to take a lot for other teams to kind of push them out of, their initial plan. And I think that was nice to see. Also, I was just interested in seeing them, crunch the numbers, going over, the probabilities of certain guys being there and actually seeing them rely on the people in the room. I think something else that I said over here and thought about, if you watched it closely, Dan Morgan was making a lot of those decisions. He was headlining, he was the head of a lot of those decisions, and it kind of went as he went. So I think, going back to think about it, it's I don't know if every GM, that's the role that they play when it comes to drafting and when it comes to off-season moves, or if it's just Dan Morgan. But if that is the case, it's just wow, I can't believe that Scott Fitter was the GM and making decisions like that. How many years was he here? Since 2018 or something like that?
Yeah, 3 or 4 years, something like that.
Yeah, and so just to see, the product of the team we had during that time frame and to see how we just, went downhill. And if he was at the forefront of that the way Dan Morgan was, then it's just nasty work. Obviously, we don't know what this team is going to look like because they haven't, stepped on the field yet as far as, competitively against other teams. But I just feel really good about this draft class and about the way it was constructed inside of the War Room and then just throughout the offseason or through last season as well. But I think Brent Tiller said something very interesting. We can do all of this. We can put this on for y'all and we can, crunch these numbers, do our due diligence and bringing in the guys who we think are the best available, who we think are the best players. But he left off by saying, it's on the players. Yeah. At this point, we did our fucking job. Now y'all have to go do y'all's job and not make us look like jackasses. So it might put some pressure on them, but pressure is good. So, I mean, if we feel like we had one of the best drafts and we got the best players available, then hopefully the results will show, depending on what they're working, how they're working.
Yeah, and to kind of touch on one of the points that you made there really quickly, I don't know if Scott was actually making those same type of decisions because I think a big thing that we harped on when Scott was here is the fact that football people weren't making football decisions. So I do kind of wonder sometimes how much of a step back Dave Tepper has taken from that time since we don't have the blueprints the same way that we do now with those bird's eye view into the War Room. But I do think it was very interesting how what is the guy that was sitting to the left?
Brant Tillis.
Brant Tillis. I thought it was very interesting how Brant was like, oh, I really want to make some moves. It was I don't really care what we do. I just want to do something.
Yeah,
I thought
very eager.
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting and seeing how, everybody else kind of kept him in place. But that's a good, you'd rather pull him back than make him, want to go seek out an opportunity. So I thought that was interesting. And I thought another thing was interesting was just having that confirmation that we all left the draft feeling like the organization was all on one accord and in lockstep in making these picks. And I do think that was reflected in the blueprint. It did seem like everybody was on board with majority of all the guys that they picked. They got their guys that they were looking for in the spots that they were looking for them in. We finally got to look behind the curtain as to the thinking behind ETN. Apparently he was pretty high on their board, even though we didn't feel that way, but they felt like that's their guy and he's going to bring value. Specifically, they said special teams value. They did mention his ability to return. So that'll be a conversation for later on in the summer when it comes to roster cutdowns. But I do think it was interesting. I also just wonder, and this is just me, the skeptic in me, I do wonder how many of these guys were truly, like, their guys. Like, how many times did they have to edit out for a player that they were looking for originally and then be like, okay, nah, actually, this is our guy. And now it looks like that was truly their guy, but there was another player that they might have been pursuing. So that there's the skeptic in me of that from just the editing, the media team. But
yeah, of course.
Yeah, but for the most part, I think it was very confirmation of what we pretty much knew.
Yeah, and then just to touch before you go, just to touch back on the situation with Scott Fitter and Dave Tepper. Like, I feel like people don't really, and if you don't know Carolina football, like, people don't really understand how good of a player Dan Morgan was. So it's like kind of hard for a guy like Dave Tepper to be like, to try to overstep him, because he's actually played the game at the highest level and was very successful at the highest level, which Scott Fitter was not. So it's probably a little easier for Dave Tepper to kind of run over him and be like, nah, I think we should do this, or I like this a little bit better. So that's something interesting to think about as well.
Yeah, and I think off of that, it's a lot better when you have somebody like that in that position. But I will say, I felt like just off of the, what we were able to see, I feel like that spirit of collaboration that I always talk about on this podcast was very, very apparent. Because even though you can feel and you can, sense that Dan Morgan is at the head of what's going on, I feel like there was still a lot of great conversations being had with, Dave, Dan, and Brent. Honestly, I was going to come on here and shit on Brent Tillis just because the way I read the article, but, the blueprint presented it in a different way. So I'm not going to do that. I actually love the relationship that Dan Morgan and Brent have. And one of the very, very interesting things that Dan Morgan said that I kind of got off of the article as well was the fact that, like, it's good not having yes men around you because they challenge you and make you, have to prove that you're making the right decision for the organization by supporting that with your conviction and with the numbers and everything in between. So I love the role that Brent Tillis played in this whole process. And, of course, I was telling the guys while we were watching it, if you guys ever seen Moneyball, their relationship seems very, very similar to the one that's portrayed in Moneyball with Jonah Hill and I think it's Brad Pitt, if I'm not mistaken. Let me see. Now I got to check. I'm sorry. ADHD, I guess, maybe. Or maybe not.
I think it is Brad Pitt.
I think it is Brad Pitt as well. I just want to be sure.
Then it's not going to be Brad Pitt, and we're going to sound like some jackasses.
Maybe. Just like I was, like, hell-bound on the fact that old girl was dead. Cassie.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah. No, it was Brad Pitt. Good job, Jeremy. But, yeah, their relationship reminds me a lot of the relationship that was portrayed on that movie, in that movie specifically. And I like it. I like it, honestly, because, like we said, it speaks to the collaboration that's going on. And I feel like when you get a lot of great brains and great minds together to come up with ultimately the best decision, that's a lot better than you just having one guy, right, making these tough decisions. And if you guys are familiar with Carolina football, specifically over the last 5 or 6 years, once Scott Fitter was let go, fired, however you want to word it, the reports started coming out that, like, there was not a lot of cohesion within the front office at all. And there was a time or another that I read an article where they were discussing Scott Fitter's approach to the draft. And they mentioned how they would have these collaborative sessions, these thought process meetings or whatever the case may be. And then Scott Fitter would just come in the war room and just make a totally different decision than what was discussed before because he had a gut feeling or whatever the case may be. I don't get that at all from this front office. Now, speaking of Tavian's point, I do believe that there's the editing and the production tricks of everything. Like, I do think that to a certain degree, obviously, you're putting on a production that you want to make your front office or whatever the case may be look like the best in the NFL, right? And look like they're competent, whatever the case may be. So I do know for a fact there was some cutting and editing on some of those interactions. However, I do believe that for the overwhelming majority, I would say 95% of the picks that we got, it seems as though, like, these really were our guys. Now, obviously, when you have a board, you're going to rank players and you're going to say, well, if this guy is gone, then we'll go here, whatever the case may be. But if those guys are on your board, then they're still your guys, in my opinion. So I think that everybody was happy, with the way things were going, or with the way things went. So that's definitely great to see. And I love the fact that there's a plan in place. I love the fact that there was a plan in place. Pre-Dan Morgan, that just simply was not the case. The Carolina Panthers have structured themselves to be this developmental organization where there is currently a youth movement within that building, and we're bringing in guys that we can mold and shape into guys that we know we want to roll out on Sunday afternoons because this is what we believe will work. And the fact that everybody is bought in on that and the fact that it's abundantly clear that that's what's going on, I personally love it.
I also, something that I forgot to mention, I also thought it was interesting when they were going over about to draft the edges, and they led with, was specifically about Nick. They're like, yeah, he can be a starter day one opposite of Pat Jones.
Yeah.
So, like, one.
Or did they say behind?
No, they said that he would be behind Pat Jones, but he could be a starter.
Starter, yeah. Which, I mean, I don't think that for me personally, and I'll come right back to you, for me personally, you shouldn't even have drafted a guy that you didn't believe could have had the ability to be a starter on this defense. Right. So, but back to you.
Yeah, like, one, ill. And two, I think that was all a clear indication that Jadeveon Clowney was not a part of this team's plans like months ago. Way before they cut
I'm glad you caught that. That's actually a phenomenal point. That's a phenomenal point because Jadeveon didn't get released until after. Mm-hmm. That's a phenomenal point because that was something that we brought up. And a lot of the comments were acting like we were tweaking, right? We had the conversation during the live stream with Dunk as well. But then we came on FPFO and we talked about it a little bit more in depth about the potential and possibility of Jadeveon Clowney no longer being with this organization. And that was something that a lot of fans were kind of like, it doesn't seem realistic. But like you just mentioned, it seemed like that was, a possibility and has been the thought process within the front office for quite some time.
And apparently Jadeveon knew it too, because on his way out, he said, like, I wish they would have told me months ago because I already knew. Yeah. Basically.
Could feel it. He said once he got the, I believe it was whatever comes before rookie.
The voluntary offseason.
Yes. He said once he got there, the vibe was already one as if he was out the door. So, yeah. It seems like that decision was made quite some time ago, and shout out to Dunk and Low for even bringing that shit up because they made me think about that completely different as well. Which once that happened, I was just kind of fixated on it and was just like, this kind of makes too much sense not to be the case. Actually, you save the money, get the older guy out, throw your younger guys in the fire, and let them roll with it.